All right, I guess we'll just get started. And try to make use of the chat a little bit to try to make this somewhat interactive. So I titled the class Teshuba, what are we returning to? Obviously, the word Teshuba, the shortish there means to return. Of course, Rambam says you're returning Yashuv Meheto, you're returning from your sin, but he doesn't say you're Azivat Hayat. He's not talking about just leaving the sin, but you're being Shav, you're returning to somewhere with a destination. And so the simple question I wanted to open up with is, what are we returning to? Right? Or in a more rude way, when we say this word Teshuva, what do we mean by this word Teshuva? So I guess everyone just take a couple minutes to reflect or throw into the chat, what are your answers to these questions? What is Teshuva and what are we returning to? And give it a second if you guys want to take a minute to mull it over. The reason I asked this question is also to try to think about another famous question that we often ask, which is, we have Rosh HaShana, which opens up what we call the Aseret Yemet Teshuvah, culminating in Yom Kippur. And there's just a famous question that many people ask, is that it just seems so backwards. That Rosh Hashanah is this new beginning where we crown Hashem and we're moving forward. And then Yom Kippur is this day where we start saying Silihot and asking for Mechila and doing Teshuvah about previous days. And that almost seems backwards. We would almost expect that, we'd first focus on our past, get rid of the past, ask for Silihah, ask for Mechila, move forward, and then, crown our king and launch ourselves into a new year. And so why that seemingly backward sequence that we have? And so to answer this question, I think we need to think a little bit more deeply about what is Rosh Hashanah really all about. So I said something about crowning the king, but what is it really all about? And the reason I asked this question is because there's not that many things to look at to answer this question. The only thing I could probably reference is maybe the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah that we say. And if we take a look at the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, it almost feels like you're in a second grade classroom. If we look at, over here, if we just look briefly at the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, share my screen again. We have the famous Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. And in Malchuyot, we're singing Alenu Shabayach, and then we say 3 famous Pesukim from the Torah, and then 3 famous Pesukim from the Ketuvim, and then 3 famous Pesukim from the Navi, and then Shema Yisrael, right? And then if we go into Zichronot, a very similar sequence where we're saying a few famous Pesukim from the Torah, 3 famous Pesukim from Ketuvim, 3 famous Pesukim from the Navi, and then 1 more from the Torah. And we go, and then the same exact thing in Shofarot, very famous Pesukim. We start singing Hallelujah, and then, culminating with 1 more Pasuk in the Torah. So when we think about the Musaf prayer, really it just seems so simplistic. And what is going on over here? So I want to try to take these questions and pull them together to create a stronger theme to Rosh Hashanah to help us understand, what is Teshuvah? What is it? What are we returning to? What is Rosh Hashanah really about? Why is it before Yom Kippur? And how does this all add up? So Jesse wrote in the chat, now, what are we returning to, or who are we returning to? We're returning to God. And, that's definitely justified. So we read yesterday in the Torah, the short parasha of Teshuvah that appears in the Torah. And so just to review it briefly, God says, so if we recall in last week's parasha, we had lengthy descriptions of both beracha that could come to us when we do good, and kilala that could come to us when we do bad. And God says, once this all happens, you realize the consequences of your actions. So Jesse, what do we have here? You're returning where? To your own heart. Returning to your own heart, what does that mean? Of course, in the next pasuk and in further pasukim will substantiate with Jesse's claim as well. Part of that return is V'shavta ad Adonai Elohecha. So you're returning to your heart, and then ad, there's like a destination, a final destination of God. Right? And then V'shav Adonai Elohecha Shutecha, God seems to as well be involved in this Teshuba process, and you'll be collected from the lands, and He'll bring you back. An interesting pasuk here is Umal Adonai Elohecha et tevavecha ve'et tevav zarecha. God will circumcise our notion of milah, right? Getting rid of foreskin, right? He'll circumcise our hearts again. So that notion of the heart and some circumcision happening over here, in order to be able lahavat Adonai Elohecha b'chol alecha b'chol nafshecha ve'ata tashuv. You'll return. You're more mishamata b'chol Adonai, listening to God. Ve'asita et kol mitzvotav asher nochim tzivcha hayom. Then you'll get good rewards. Right? As you will return, like Jesse said, to God. Okay, so in the simplest form, we're returning to God, but there's something a little bit more here, as we're also returning to our own hearts, and there's a circumcision of our hearts happening. So there's something there. Again, I'm keeping things very vague, very not clear. What are we returning to? How are we returning? What is the point of all this process? How do we understand this day of Rosh Hashanah, this beginning of Aseret Yemei Teshuba? And so, in further exploring this question, I think a big highlight of the day that we talk about on Rosh Hashanah, or at least we glorify, is the story of the Akedah. We read it in the Torah. We have the Piyut, right? Aked v'han me'akad. So we definitely glorify the story of the Akedah. So I'm hoping with maybe examining the story of the Akedah just in a simple way, we'll have a little bit more to understand this. So the story of the Akedah, we're all very, very familiar with, right? Goes as follows. God tells Abraham, take your favorite son. Abraham gets up early, travels, goes 3 days. He tells his Na'arav, him and Yitzhak go up. Yitzhak says, I don't understand, what's the Korban? And they keep going. He builds him his Mizbeach, he binds Yitzhak, he's ready to slaughter him, right? And then suddenly, Abraham, stop. I know you're now God-fearing. And he slaughters the ram instead. And so if I had to ask you, what is the climax of the story? What is the most climactic moment of the story? You could take a second to answer, but I have no doubt that most of you will answer it's when Abraham is just told to stop. And so if we elaborate on the story a little bit and give it a little color to the background, yes, the story is a few Pesukim in the Torah, but imagine a time where child sacrifice is common. Imagine a time, a person, an individual in Abraham who is introspective, who thinks about everything, who realizes God on his own, who interacts with people on high levels, right? We can imagine this, it wasn't just one morning he woke up and God said, let's go do this, and he went to do this. This is probably something that Abraham had thought about in the past, had spoken to people about in the past, had philosophized in the past, had considered the moral, ethical dilemmas that go into it. He'd been thinking about this for a long, long time in his life, and probably built understandings and reached conclusions. And when the Nivu'ah came, he was ready and confident, and he had conviction to go and be ready to go slaughter his son. And then there's a build-up to the story. He's traveling, and the Midrash colors up the story of his travel, how there's this Satan that gets him to doubt himself, and he's always doubting himself, but he perseveres, he continues, right? to the point where his convictions are strong. And the climax of the story is simply Abraham, don't do it. Why? Short sentence, not a lot of philosophical explanation to not doing it. And he just goes home. And so we always think, like, what changed? What happened? Right? You went from this is an ideal to don't do it. And I think that the real messaging of the story is just that sometimes as we're building our convictions, as we're building our ideals, as we're, further thinking about things, further philosophizing about things, further discussing with other people about things, further realizing what ideals we're supposed to be pursuing, we build real strong convictions. And we want to act passionately on those strong convictions. And we think there's a great, best thing to be doing with ourselves and our time. And I think the story of Abraham and the Akedah is telling us that sometimes being a better person is not necessarily furthering your convictions. It's not acting out on your convictions. It's not about building up what you think is good and ideal, but sometimes it's just stopping in your tracks. Sometimes it's just about pausing and saying and breaking down those ideals and convictions that you have. And so when we ask the question, what is Teshuba? What are we returning to? What is Rosh HaShanah about? What is the shofar blowing about? And we have this pent-up desire to be better, to make resolutions, to build on ourselves, to further our belief in God, to better understand things, to move forward. The Akedah is teaching us that sometimes it's just about stopping in our tracks, pausing, and going back to second grade, and not furthering your belief in God in some sophisticated way. And so what are we supposed to be thinking about during the shofar blowing? Is absolutely nothing. We're just supposed to be hearing the call of Abraham, just stop, just don't do this. I believe that is a lot of what's underlying the Akedah story. I believe that this is what the Torah means when it says, return to your heart and God will circumcise your heart. We think that sin is predicated on lack of idealism. We're not strong enough in our ideals. We falter. We know what we want to do. We know what we're supposed to be doing, but we're not strong enough to do it, right? But I would venture to say that may be true in a lot of cases, but very often as well, sometimes sin is created by having too strong of ideals, building too much ideals. And so Rosh Hashanah tells us, go back to your second grade classroom. Yeah, I know you studied and philosophized 1 billion times about what God is and who he is and how he works and how everything's going to work on Yom HaDin and the punishment and the reward and what you're supposed to be doing and what you're not supposed to be doing. But the shofar tells us to stop. And the Musaf on Rosh Hashanah tells us to go back to second grade. Let's chant Hallelujah together. Let's chant Alin L'Shabeach together. Let's say the most famous 10 Pesukim we know about the most simple topics that we know. Let's refresh our understanding of God, our understanding of religion, our understanding with this is all about, and just go back a little bit to the basics. And I think that's why it's so important that Rosh Hashanah precedes Yom Kippur. Because yes, Yom Kippur is a day where we reflect, we introspect, We try to become better. We think about all the actions we did. We think about all the actions we're going to do differently. Were we to do that before Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah would never even be able to have any impact on us, because we'd be so caught up in our day-to-day thinking, in our ideals, in our passions, in what's important to us, and what we're going to do and how we're going to move forward. And that's an important step in the process. But it's so much more important that before we do that, we stop and get simple for a second. I think that is a lot of the messaging of Rosh Hashanah. And I think that there's a lot of reason to that. And we're noticing a lot about it today. And now I'll share just a little bit about my personal thoughts. First of all, as noted by a lot of philosophers, as much as we build ideas, there's a rooted problem of induction, right? So early problem popularized by David Hume and furthered by Karl Popper and totally infiltrates the way our scientific process works, which is to say that if everything we have is building upon theory and furthering upon our inductions, we induce concepts, we actually can never really validate that those are true. So if we're always scaffolding upon this foundation that may not even be, then we're maybe reaching conclusions that are so far out of our reach, right? And so Karl Popper says, well, can't be the way our scientific method is going to work. And the importance is falsifiability. The importance is working in the reverse, right? And this is clear in Harambam when we talk about how we understand God. When we talk about who God is, we can't speak about who God is. We can't build theories about who God is, right? We can't even get close to that. All we can speak about is what God is not, and just notice the falsifiable elements and create theories that are falsifiable. And the more falsifiable, the better off we are with them. And that's, from a philosophical lens, why Rosh Hashanah is important, to break down our convictions, to pause in our passion and beliefs, and to rewind the clock to second grade. A further point in this is I was teaching in Barkai a couple of years ago, and I did an experiment with all the classes. And the experiment is very simple. I hope I could explain it well. I write on the board a pattern. The pattern reads 2, 4, 8. That's the pattern. And I tell the class that there is one rule in my head that governs the pattern that I wrote. I'm not going to tell you what that rule is, but I'm going to allow you to guess 10 patterns that will give you more evidence to be able to guess what the rule behind my head is. And so this is a younger, 12, 13-year-old kids. So they say, 2, 4, 8. What about 4, 8, 16? What about 20, 40, 60, 200, 400, 800? And they basically give you 10 responses that all resemble the 2, 4, 8, 2 doubling to 4, doubling to 8, using even numbers, right, in a very simple method. And all I answer to those 10 is either yes, it fits my rule, or no, it does not fit my rule. And of course, the answer to all the examples they gave was yes, it did fit my rule. And so what was my rule after they said 10 guesses? They said, your rule must have been that you were doubling the number, 2, double to 4, double to 8. So no, that wasn't my rule, actually. You see, all my rule is that I was going to write increasing numbers on the board. And so if you guessed 3, 5, 7, I would have also answered yes. And 10, 92, 300, I would have also answered yes. But you were so caught up on the notion that 2, 4, 8 instinctively felt like the rule was doubling. It felt like a more strong rule than just increasing numbers. And so the only research you did was numbers that doubled. You didn't ask me about a descending order. What about 10, 9, 8? You didn't ask me about 1, 2, 3. You didn't ask me about half numbers or negative numbers. You didn't even get close to that. Right? And so when we're doing research, we need falsifiable evidence. We need to not just test the 2, 4, 8 and the 200, 400, 800, but to test the 357 or the 9221. And that births what's known as a very famous psychological phenomenon today, which is a lot of our confirmation bias. And we see it exhibited today with social media and technology excessively. We imagined an age with an internet where information was beyond accessible, that people would grow wiser and smarter, but also be more dynamic and realize more of a multiplicity to the world. Realize that there's a lot of different things going on and a lot of different theories that can be substantiated and validated. But what's actually become is that people are furthering and furthering their own convictions and validating them and finding more and more information to further validate their own personal beliefs. And it works. They do find research that have 248s, and they find an infinite amount of evidence that support that 248 means the pattern's doubling. But that's not the rule over here. The rule is maybe a little bit simpler. And they've never even encountering this evidence because they're so hung up in the confirmation bias. And so I think that the messaging we go into with Rosh Hashanah is not, oh, I'm going to be a better person because I'm going to further my convictions. I'm going to build upon the 248, and I'm going to build more and more and do more within the convictions that I have, within the beliefs that I have, within the ideals that I have, which are respectable and should be grown. But before we do that, we have a more simple, basic process that tells us stop, go back to second grade. Yes, you have a lot of strong beliefs. Yes, they're valuable in a lot of ways. But what beliefs are they blocking you from? What other ideals are they blocking you from pursuing because you're so rooted in that belief? And so go back to second grade. Go back to that second grade classroom. Read a few Pesukim together. Listen to a shofar that just tells you to stop. Think like Abraham Avinu in the Akedah. Think like Abraham Avinu, who had 100 years, more than 100 years, to build values and ideals and thoughts. And I guarantee you child sacrifice was something he studied well and knew well about, and it didn't just pop up in one pasuk and disappear in another pasuk. And this is something that he reached a point of conviction that this is the ultimate best thing I can be doing right now, based on years of thought, based on a lot of sophisticated ideas, based on a lot of other people and influences around him. And he reached a point where he knew this is it. And the Midrash illustrates that as much as there was a Sutton being Mekatadeg, as much as there was, other elements trying to deter him from it, he pushed forward, he moved on. And with all of that conviction, he was able to just hear a word that said stop with no explanation. And he just stopped and just didn't do it and realized that probably the best thing was not to do this. And he moved on into a completely different course. I believe that's the messaging of Rosh Hashanah. I believe that's what it means when we say Teshuba, yes, to God, but Ele levavecha, to your heart, to your simple, naive heart, resembling a certain naivete, to the circumcision of all the layers on the heart. That's not just all the layers of bad influence, but all the layers of anything that you have in the heart. To circumcise and remove all of that and just go back to a basic version of it and then build upon that. I'll leave a couple minutes for questions or thoughts. Anybody? You could write in the chat. You could unmute yourself, or just we could call it here.
Very nice, Ovadia. Very nice.
You like it, Jeff?
Did.
All right.
והשבותה אל לבביך ושבת עד השם. Is two steps?
I'm saying that number one is letting go and go back to your basic elements of the heart. That process seems to be continued, right? In the pasuk, there's el and then ad, right? So there's a further destination, which is to God, but it's preceded by this el levavecha. That is my understanding.
So then letting go of your ideals is not necessarily to God. Letting go of your ideals just cleans the slate so you can almost get on a different path
Right.
towards God.
Yeah, maybe there's another, even though you think you understand God, right? Abraham had a pretty strong understanding of God. There could be another direction of understanding God. So, right? Our understanding of God nested led us to Galut. Our actions nested led us to Galut. If we just stopped doing things, that wouldn't necessarily change the more rooted causes, right? If you're reading Sefer Melachim, there's like a long evolution of how bad ideals got. And as much as Melachim easily illustrates it was good and bad, right? There's clearly philosophies underlying, and not just political alliances, but how God works. And if you're reading the Nevi'im, they're believing in multiple gods, and it could work, and there's a tandem there, right? There's strong philosophies that create this hundreds of years of evolution. And if we just say, oh, we just got to stop worshiping idols, stop doing the bad things because they're tempting, or stop creating political alliances because they're tempting, that's a very fleeting, temporary way of doing Teshuba. If I say, maybe I had this all wrong from the beginning, maybe I didn't fully understand who God is, how he works, maybe there's something different over here, then I could go 10 steps back and then rebuild my understanding of God and not even end up close to that. And that's sort of the point of the Galut. Yeah, we have chances, but when we hit a bad point, we really have to go all the way back. I see somebody asked the question, how do we know that the little voice that told Abraham to stop was not just his own fear? So interesting question. I'm taking, personally, within the format of this class, I'm taking the statement of the Pasuk, Vayikra elav malach Adonai min hashamayim, right? So this is malach as a messenger representing God's will over here, that was a representation of an ideal of what God wanted. And again, Malach Adonai calls out again that you did right. So I am taking for granted that is Abraham's, that it's the Malach. It's not a fear in his own head. It's some Malach of God. I actually heard an interesting class yesterday from Rabbi Ricky Hidari, who spoke towards levels of Nebu'ah, and he explained how the story of the Akedah is a development of Abraham's Nebu'ah, and the climax is a further level of Nebu'ah where he understood a little more. So according to that, yes, maybe it was something that happened in Abraham's head, but also through a process of prophecy that helped him better understand the ideal, not less understand the ideal. So that's the best answer I have to that question. Anyway, we're at about 10:31, so we're a little over time, but thank you everybody for joining. And enjoy the rest of the day of classes. There's a lot going on. The SCA has created a great platform for today. They began a fundraiser, so I think we should all consider making contributions to continue enabling this platform to grow and be able to present so much opportunity for us to learn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ovadia. Take the good. I knew to pick your class. I knew you get something thought provoking. I'll see you. Thank you.
All right. I'll see you.